Good day to you. Just a minute, if you would, please. I'm watching something here.
Anyway, the name of the album is Eat Out More Out, right? So I'm thinking we got the girl lying on the daybed here,
Yeah,
sleeping
I'll,
with
I'll
the
be with you in just a minute. I'm watching a
you
movie.
see what I'm saying? Hey, let me show you what Krista worked out. Now, Krista, honey, show him what we worked out.
Yikes, I didn't expect that was going to happen. I'm actually just watching a movie for the first time called Marvin Gaye. Thought I'd tune it in actually because of our last class on audio. And in our last class on audio, we were talking about how crossover artists such as Motown helped to make rock and roll. But I'm watching a movie now telling that story. And although we just saw some nudity there, which did not expect, but I'm going to leave it in because we're all mature adults, it gets to the idea that we take in movies for a lot of reasons. We take in movies to tell stories about real people like Marvin Gaye, a Motown musician. We take in movies for other reasons as well. And when we take in movies, it's very hard for us to release ourselves from them. And that's what I tried to get across when I pretended to be too busy to be able to start the lecture today. So we're talking about movies today, and actually, movies were very affected by the pandemic over the last year. It's an amazing circumstance that happened to this form of mass media because people could not go to movie theaters. And so, what was lost over the last year as we take on Chapter 7 movies? What was lost over the last year as we take on Chapter 7 and start and talk about movies? Well, one thing that was lost was a form of escape, right? Movies are used for escape. I mean, the screens are larger than life. We go into a theater that gets dimly lit where we can't see anything else but the screen. We're in a place that's not our own. It's a shopping mall or it's a movie theater complex or a multiplex as they're called. And we are there to do one thing. We're there to get away from whatever it is that we've just left behind. We're escaping. That's what movies are often about. And also, movies are just about passing the time. People have a lazy Sunday, or they have a very hot day in the summer, or it's raining outside, and you're looking for ways to pass the time, so we go to movies. Also, movies are a way of feeling like we're avoiding being lonely. If we're by ourselves for too long, we can go be with other people, but we don't have to actually be with other people. You know what I mean? We can be in the room with other people and feel like we're with a crowd, but we're not alone. That's the main thing we're using a movie for. Also, movies can be used for stimulating a romance. You want to go on a date. You want to go to a safe place. You don't want to go to a bar. You don't want to go to their family member's house. You don't want to go shopping. You want to do something where it has a possibility of being romantic and also give you an out if things don't go well. And that's what a movie is all about. And sometimes we go to movies to get away from our cell phone, maybe even if it's subconscious. We're just doing that because we know that we cannot be on the phone and we can't control ourselves. And actually, we have to wait for that message to come on the movie screen that says turn cell phones off before we finally do. And then the movie is helping us to get away from something we have an addiction to. So, movies do a lot of things for us. But content wise, how are movies different from other forms of mass media, such as the book, such as radio, such as other forms of mass media that we're studying? Movies tend to be edgier. They tend to be edgier and more over the top, especially compared to the closest mass medium to movies, and that's got to be television. So we're going to take on movies. We're going to start with where they were invented. We're going to start with that inventor we mentioned last time, Thomas Edison, who does have a national park in his name just outside of New York City. Yeah, did you know that? You can go to the Thomas Edison National Park and you can see many of his inventions or his company's inventions. Among them, movie making equipment. Yeah, you can see a lot of movie making equipment at Thomas Edison's park just outside of New York City in New Jersey. So Thomas Edison is the one who's credited with developing the American motion picture industry more than anybody else. It's called motion picture because it's pictures in motion, right? That's what it was originally called. And then it became known as movies. Something moving is a movie. That's what chiefly described it as being a different medium from anything else. It was something was moving in it. And then film also is a way that we describe this medium because of the original medium that film or movies were imprinted upon, film strips. So we'll talk about Edison in a moment, but let's talk first about a French person who got things going. His name was Etienne. That's his first name, Etienne Jules Marey, Marey. And he developed a system for taking photos repeatedly of people in motion. As always, I have links for you today. You can follow along and see what I'm talking about, including Etienne Marey's invention. And basically, if you take a bunch of flip cards like you did when you were a kid with photographs on them, you flip them, that's creating the illusion of motion, right? And that's what Etienne Jules Marey, the Frenchman, did. Along comes an American named Edward Muybridge. Edward Muybridge, he spells his first name very differently, E-A-D-W-E-A-R-D, Edward Muybridge. He invented a zoetrope. A zoetrope is a series of images that are on a spinning cylinder. And so the cylinder spins around with light going through it, and the images appear, since they're moving around on the cylinder, to be in motion rather than being a new image replacing an old image. And there was a governor of California who was trying to figure out whether a horse puts all four hooves on the ground when it gallops. That was a big area of debate. Today, we wouldn't even think about such kinds of things to debate, but in those times, nobody had ever captured it in a photograph or in film, right? That's the only way you could capture it. When a horse is galloping, are all four hooves ever at one time up in the air? So Edward Muybridge, with his technology, was challenged by the governor to show whether that was the case, and that's one of the very first films showing that, in fact, a horse's hooves do leave the ground. All four are off the ground at one different time. So Edison is still in the game here, and he comes along, looks at this technology, the zoetrope, and he develops the kinetoscope, which is a similar kind of invention, which is using, again, that kind of very primitive motion technology, motion illusion. And in Edison's case, he develops the kinetoscope, which is looking like what today you would consider to be a Nickelodeon. It's a machine where you look down into a viewfinder. Only one person can look at it at a time, and you can see motion that's created by pictures. And in the case of Edison, one of the very first scenes of his movie was Annie Oakley. It was the name of a female riding her horse. And you can see that in the kinetoscope. But again, it's a very private experience until two French filmmakers come along, two French filmmakers by the names of Lumiere, that was their last name, L-I-M-L-U-M-I-E-R-E, a word that again is synonymous with the units of electricity today. Light bulbs are measured in luminums in terms of how bright they are. Lumiere, the Lumiere brothers invented the cinematograph. And this was the first time you have a projector that's pushing the film onto a screen. I mean, nothing like a screen that we have today, but taking it outside of a box like a kinetoscope where you have to look in a viewfinder and putting it onto a wall where more than one person can watch a film. That's the breakthrough for movies. That's all movies needed because from then on, now it was a medium that was really going to hit its stride. And so we start to get directors entering the movie industry. The very first one was Edwin Porter that we want to mention, Edwin Porter. And he was first to tell the story with the film The Great Train Robbery. He's the first to use film to tell a story. Other kinds of film are just capturing people in real motion, but he captures this film that's called The Great Train Robbery, and it's just what it sounds like. It's all about a train robbery that takes place where bandits get on board a train and they have a gunfight on board, and people are hurt. There's outlaws, there's passengers, people are killed. It's the very first realistic story to take place in filmmaking. The next filmmaker we want to highlight has a name of D.W. Griffith. Yeah, he's got initials for his first name, D.W. Griffith. He had the very first blockbuster film. A blockbuster film is a term that we use to describe films that are epic movies. You know what epic means? It means their themes are timeless. They never go away. So that's one feature of a blockbuster film. They're epic. And secondly, they capture the nation's imagination. Like the whole nation is caught up in this film, talking about the film for days on end, imitating the film's characters by wearing their clothes, saying lines from the film, trying to figure out what happened in the film. That's what a blockbuster is all about. And a blockbuster is also, and D.W. Griffith developed this, the first films that were an hour length or more, which is what we call a feature-length film, a film that's more than an hour. And films eventually settled into 2 hours as being the sweet spot for films, although some are longer and some are shorter. So anyway, D.W. Griffith's film, to finally mention that, is called Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation in 1915, a very controversial film by those days' standards and also by today's standards, because the film Birth of a Nation told the story of the rise of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, in the years following the Civil War. And in this film, it portrayed black people as beasts. Those were the words used to describe the most common association with how black people were portrayed in this film and how people saw them as being portrayed, and portrayed black people as attacking the North. So the controversy is, did this film just depict actual sentiments that existed in 1915 and it's doing nothing more than recording history? Or does this film promote further racism already in place from our history and perceiving of blacks in a way that makes it continually difficult for them to gain equality? That's the main question. You'll have to answer that for yourself. You can see Birth of a Nation. It's in the links for today. But that's D.W. Griffith and what he's known for, the first blockbuster film, Birth of a Nation. Now, also, we can say that D.W. Griffith is also known for movie stars. He took people who acted in his films and elevated them to star status. Prior to that, people who acted in films, they were paid a salary. They weren't allowed to have credits many times. They actually had their lives controlled by studios who were producing their films, and they were just another worker on the set. But D.W. Griffith changed that. One of the first people he did that with was a movie star by the name of Florence Griffith, female movie star Florence Griffith, and he started to also pay her big money, star-studded money, and that starts to change the whole complexion of what a star is like in the studio system. Speaking of studio system, let's talk about what that's about now, because we are kind of sneaking it into our conversation here. So did you know that the very first films, the very first movies, the very first motion pictures were made in New Jersey? Did you know that they were made in New Jersey, just outside of New York City? The first films were made there because they could get into the city and they could create scenes on the streets of New York. It was seen as a great place, movie backdrops as streets of New York. But unfortunately, the system that was in place was studios, of which there were few. They owned everything. They employed the writers, the directors, and the actors, and all of them worked for a weekly salary. The movies themselves were put together in assembly line production fashion, just like a factory, just like the Industrial Revolution. Big surprise, right? People were sitting there. It was like that, mass production. And the relationship between movie studios and theaters was problematic because theaters were required to purchase what were known as block bookings if they wanted any movies at all. A block booking means that they have to book a bunch of films just to get a few good ones. There could be a bunch of lemons in there. They have to purchase 12 films to get 2 or 3 from the studio. And they didn't even get to see the films before they arrived. So that's the studio system. It was a stranglehold on the industry until a group of people, mainly based in a group called United Artists, this group of actors and scriptwriters and others, group of actors and scriptwriters, they wanted to seize control of this process. One of the members of the UA, as it was known, United Artists, by the way, was Charlie Chaplin. He was that comedian from old-time films, silent films. He wore a bowler hat. He had a mustache. Black and white films. He didn't talk at all, and he wobbled when he walked. I don't know if you've seen any of his films. He was a member of that. Well, what happened was the studio system was changed forever because the entire industry moved from New Jersey to Hollywood, California. Hollywood, California, where you can have westerns, you can have snow-capped mountains, you can have surfing, because of the landscapes available in Hollywood, California. You've got desert, you've got suburbs, you've got mountains, you've got the ocean, you've got fair weather skies all year round. At that time, you had a lot of open space, you had plentiful talent, a lot of people there. Hollywood just became a natural, and so the studio system began to be smashed. It took some other events, though, to smash that studio system, including a 1938 Department of Justice ruling. A 1938 Department of Justice ruling. That ruling was concerned about monopolies that the studio system were basically comprised of, and so it started to limit block bookings, saying that theater owners get to see films before they have to book them. So that's one change that came about because of the 1938 ruling. And then in 1948, 10 years later, the Supreme Court, no less, ruled that studios have to sell their theaters. They have to sell any theaters that they own so that they can't control the distribution of films at all. Let's move on now to talk about the Blacklist. You know about the Blacklist? Okay, pretty sordid time period in American movie making history, the Blacklist. So After World War II, there was a big fear of communism here in the United States. A lot of people afraid of communism. The chief public figure afraid of it was Senator Eugene McCarthy, who was starting a kind of inquisition, questioning people whether they were members of the Communist Party. And there happened to be 10 people in Hollywood who were on this list to be questioned. They were writers, they were actors. 10 people, they were asked to come before Congress to answer some questions about any relations they may have with the Communist Party. This is after World War II. There's a huge Cold War going on between the Soviet Union, which was communist, and which had spread throughout Europe and the United States. Cold War, because there were never actually any missiles launched, but we were at war each other for like 40 years. And so that was going on, and communism was very feared of in this country. And McCarthy held these hearings. He invited these 10 Hollywood actors, and they refused to show up, so they blacklisted them. They blacklisted them, and they put them in jail. So blacklisting means they're not allowed to make Hollywood films. Anybody saw their name on the list? No, you're on the blacklist. We're not letting you into this party, so to speak. So that list, by the way, grew to 324 people. Wow. That's why I say it's a sordid period. Nothing was ever proven. All right, let's go on to television and movies. Television comes on the scene in the 1950s, and just like it kind of screwed over radio, so to speak, it also caused film to have lots of problems. So here's a scenario. Because of the Industrial Revolution, people moved from villages and small towns and rural areas, including mountains, to cities where they work in factories, and they have a whole new life where they can choose what occupations they want. They have spending money. They're not living in the healthiest conditions, but they have a completely different change of life. And so what starts to happen is those cities start to become so dense, and people start to say, you know what, I'm living in anonymity here. I don't know my neighbor next door. They're right on the other side of this wall. I have no backyard. I'm working in a factory. There's pollution all over. I'm painting the worst possible picture of a city. I'm moving to this new thing that's coming about called the suburbs. Okay, so suburbs start to grow up in the 1950s in the United States. These are developments. These are communities. Some of them are gated, but they are outside and they require a vehicle to conduct your life. You have to drive to get places. So movie theaters in the middle of cities are no longer attractive to people living in the suburbs. And so what happens is television moves right on in, right? TV is in people's homes in the suburbs, so people are starting to watch movies on TV screens in their houses, located 2.3 miles from the grocery store and 25 miles from the city because they want to stay in their homes. And so the movie theater business starts to have big problems with sales, right? So what happens? So what happens is there's a reaction. And movie theaters start to produce what are known as larger-than-life movies. Larger-than-life movies. The first one of which that we want to mention in this class is Spartacus and the Ten Commandments, two different films. But Spartacus is the one that you have an example of in the links today. And you'll see the expansiveness of the set. Much of it which is fake, done through Hollywood filmmaking techniques. But just look at the amount of people in that epic Greek, Roman army thriller, military thriller, Spartacus with Kirk Douglas. And so to make that TV screen so big, the TV in its tiny little footprint in the living room, there's no way that it can compete with it. Also, Hollywood started to really push the use of color. Color was not used in film or TV for a long time. It required much more expense on the part of the person owning the TV set and on the part of the movie theater using projectors to produce color, and also to produce films in color was very, very expensive. But finally that started to change. The increased use of color, Gone with the Wind, the film Gone with the Wind, and also Wizard of Oz, two early films to use coloration techniques that by today look like they're almost animated films, but the first films nonetheless to use color. Also in the 1950s, 3D was tried with movies, 3 dimensions. Believe it or not, yeah, people wore those glasses in the movie theaters to see 3Ds. A Creature of the Black Lagoon, one of the first films with 3D, and it's come back and to some extent in this millennial generation. Also, the movie industry reacted by growing multiplex theaters. Multiplex theaters to get people out of their houses in the suburbs, not people walking in the city to go see a film. So multiplex theaters, you know what they are, right? You can go in, you can see one of any, like 12 different movies. And sometimes you have the same movie That's showing in the same multiplex theater. One might be in digital, or they'll both be in digital. One might be in 3D, one might not be. One might be have Spanish subtitles, one might not. That's the multiplex theater, and they can be quite elaborate, right? I go to a multiplex theater in Mexico, and it's got reclining chairs, and they bring you tacos or pizza or whatever you want while you're eating. It's a very, very lavish affair. All right, now let's move to, and also in those multiplex theaters, you get a bunch of other stuff too. Premium refreshments, which cost you way more than you would ever pay anywhere else except for maybe an airport. It's an expensive enterprise to go to filmmaking. You also have high fidelity sound systems, really expensive sound systems to create rumbles and really get inside of your body, and stadium seating, right? You don't have to look over people's shoulders. Now let's talk about the movie business, and in particular the blockbuster era, because that's what all movies are after. They're after achieving the blockbuster. So when did the era start? We already identified the Birth of a Nation was a blockbuster film, but it wasn't really until the 1970s that we get a whole era of blockbuster films. With the 1975 Steven Spielberg film, Jaws. Jaws. That was the very first film to create what we call the blockbuster era. It was a big summer movie. That's when blockbusters typically are released. And I got to tell you, this film still has legs. I don't know if that's the right metaphor for a shark film, but I know people still today who will not go in the water at the New Jersey shore because of that film about the great white shark eating people up. This was the first movie to gross more than $200 million. Doesn't seem like much by today's standards, but that was a lot of money back then. And it was accompanied by a big ad campaign on television. And it was based on a paperback book by Peter Benchley, the author, called Jaws. So there was a lot of cross promotion across many different media, which is what makes the blockbuster possible. We're starting to see all these different media being developed in our society, right? And now we're seeing products crossing over, in this case, in film, in blockbusters. Other blockbuster films that followed in the 70s, which are still going today as franchises in many cases, include Star Wars, Indiana Jones, Spider-Man, it's out in the theaters right now, Pirates of the Caribbean, Dark Knight, Twilight, and Final Destination. All right, let's move to talking about the home video now. We talked about television threatening movies. Well, the home video, or the VHS, VHR, VHS, old terms by now, they were the first units to threaten film in the home, other than television. I guess I shouldn't say first units. The first units to do it in the way that they did it, I should say. Video cassette recorders. That magnetic tape that was invented for sound recording also made its way over into video recording. It was the first time, you can see a picture of a VHS recorder, some of your grandparents may still have one sitting around, that you could actually record something off of television and then play it back at your own convenience. And that was a profound change in audience uses of media. I've got to tell you, before that, you would not be able to do anything with the timing of when media was delivered. You would have to accept the NFL football game when it comes down. You'd have to accept the made-for-movie TV, the made-for-TV movie when it was aired on Monday night at 8 o'clock. And if you weren't there in front of that TV set, you didn't get to see it. That all changes with the VHS, video cassette recorders, and the VHS, or the VH, that was a particular kind of video. What does that H stand for? I can't remember. It's going to drive me nuts, but VCRs, video cassette recorders, VHS was the video high definition tape, I think. By 1995, 85% of all homes had a VHS or VCR, whereas beforehand, none. That's amazing. That's amazing. And it opened up older movies to newer audiences. You could see classics like Gone with the Wind. If you didn't grow up in the 1940s, 30s, which you did, you can watch that film on VHS. Now that technology, the cassette tape, was replaced by DVDs. You know about those. And the store Blockbuster, do you remember that store? We used to rent these out. It's gone out of business by now because Netflix came along and originally was doing DVDs by mail, and then they just do everything by streaming now, right? So home video challenged movies. It also was another threat to get people not to go to multiplex theaters, but to watch their stuff in the home. Now let's talk about digital production and how that infected films. The very first film to use digital production techniques was 2004's Sky Captain and the World of Tomorrow. It's the first American movie in which all sets and backgrounds were computer generated, computer animated. You can see a clip of that in your links today and see what it's like to take a look at the very first 2004, not too long ago, 17 years ago, first mainstream American movie to use computer-generated graphics. Now let's talk today about what makes a movie. And by the way, many movies just use them today. I mean, Star Wars, there's a great example. I mean, not Star Wars, Spider-Man, there's a great example right now of the latest that you can see in computer generated graphics. Now, what does make a movie profitable? We should ask about that because only 20 to 30% of movies actually make money. They are very expensive. The cost of production, the stars' salaries, promotion is very expensive as well. The easiest way is to produce a blockbuster. That's why all movie production companies are chasing the blockbuster. And how do you produce a blockbuster? Usually with big stars. You have big name stars and a big name director. A big name director also is part of the equation today. And then you sell licensed products, DVDs, and all the merchandising that goes along with it. And you can be successful without really anticipating it. A film like Black Panther, we look at it today like, of course that's going to be successful. Had a production budget of $200 million, but it brought in $700 million domestically and about a little less than 1.5 million globally on a $200 million budget, so you can have a big hit. Let's turn our attention now to addressing the question of movies and society. How much influence do movies have on society? Well, there's been a lot of talk about that. Today, when we look at murders, we often look at what film watching habits people have had and whether we think that influenced it. This kind of question has been asked in many different shapes and forms. One of the original films it was asked for was Clark Gable. He was an American actor. His film, It Happened One Night. And in that film, he took off his shirt. And under his shirt, he had no white undershirt, a shirt that today is unfortunately called a wife beater. That used to be the common clothing that males would wear underneath the dress shirt. And when he took off his dress shirt, he didn't have that on, and sales of that undershirt plummeted, and men stopped wearing undershirts. Other studies, such as the Pain Fund studies, P-A-Y-N-E, Pain Fund studies of the 1920s, they found that 3/4 of all movies that are produced by Hollywood deal with crime, sex, or love. Wow. Okay. Is that bad? How do you define those? That's what I want to know. Social psychologist Herbert Bloomler, he found that young people initiate behaviors that they see in movies. And in fact, there was a lot of talk about a film called The Program. Do you know about that film? It stars a college quarterback in which he performs extreme stunts like lying down on a railroad track in front of a train, and a Pennsylvania teen died by doing that not too long afterwards. All right, let's turn our attention to Bollywood now. Bollywood, do you know about Bollywood? Okay, it sounds funny right away. It's meant to be because that's India's way of mocking Hollywood. They do Bollywood. And Bollywood is actually bigger than Hollywood. Can you believe that? They produce more movies, 1,000 per year, than Hollywood. Amazing. Probably the most famous movie is Slumdog Millionaire that's coming out of there. They have a more conservative approach content-wise, or just generally speaking, not much kissing, if any at all. And also just structure-wise, Bollywood can have up to 10 storylines per film, and Hollywood may have only 2. All right, let's talk about diversity in movies now. Well, Hollywood has been criticized for being very white, and it was a couple years ago that finally the Oscars gave their first awards to non-white people. There's a lot of whitewashing that goes on, where actors portray people of color in films. And we see that more in television. We're going to take a look at that when we look at TV next time, but you have white actors playing non-white people in films, and generally speaking, non-white people are not represented in film as much as they are in society in terms of proportions, percentages of Hispanics in society, percentages of African Americans, percentages of Asians. They're not represented in those same percentages in films. What about censorship? Well, the American film industry has always been resistant to censorship, and whenever the government has threatened censorship, as it has done over the years, the motion picture industry has tried to develop a system that says, hey, we're going to develop our own system and it works. And so you can see various systems that have been developed, but basically we have a system developed by the Motion Picture Association, which has G for general audiences, PG for parental guidance, PG-13 for parents strongly caution, R for under 17s, NC-17 for no one under age 17 admitted, and then you have XXX, which is pornography, which is not actually an official rating, but the pornography industry realized that the American Motion Picture Association did not patent the XXX, so they did it for their own industry to make a joke of the others. And it kind of points out that really those serve as promotional tools to get into a film, because I can tell you, if there was an R-rated film when I was a kid, when I was 16, that's what we were going to try and get into. Now, what does a movie of futures look like? Well, as always, it's tough to say. We know that there will be pay-per-view films that continue to be available because the audience has demands for films where they want to watch a film on their own time. We know that movies and the internet will have some kind of an association. You can see trailers on the internet now. Whether we'll be able to see films readily on the internet is still a long way to be determined. And we know that movies will continue to have a long tail, which is to say that movies produced in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s can still find a profitable home on Netflix, Hulu, and other streaming services where they still exist and can make money. So that wraps up movies. Hope you have a great day.